Hi, a very warm, happy, and healthy new year. I'm very excited that we're going to be kicking off our new year and prepare for the launch of Office Shock, which will be available globally next week, the 17th of January. And to start off our launch of the book, I'm very excited that my co-author, Bob Johansen, is with us today, who is going to engage in a conversation about full spectrum thinking. Now, why are we beginning our Office Shock talks with full spectrum thinking? We're going to have a number of talks where we're going into details of the actual mixing board, the quick start guide, which is going to take place on Thursday with our co-author, Chris Bullen. We will have talks also over the next few weeks going into depth into the spectrums. But today's talk is very important because being ready for Office Shock, being able to navigate Office Shock, to create better futures for working and living really does depend on having a full spectrum mindset. So we're going to spend some time with Bob learning about full spectrum thinking, which is based on his previous book, Full Spectrum Thinking. We're going to also spend some time today looking at how the three authors have applied full spectrum thinking to the spectrums of choice, those critical areas which in our research in Office Shock really are the key areas where leaders, organizations, and also communities need to make some choices in order to turn Office Shock, the changes that have been happening since the pandemic, into opportunities to create better futures for working and living. We're going to have some time also for a Q&A, and then we will be wrapping up with a reminder of all of the related talks and other activities about the book that we're all very, very excited to be bringing to this audience and to audiences around the globe. So with that, let's jump in. And I'd like to ask Bob to give us a real pithy definition of full spectrum thinking. What is it? Why is it important? And what do you see as being those signals that really ask all of us to be thinking full spectrum?
Thanks, Joseph, and great to be with you all. Full spectrum thinking is the ability to think across gradients of possibility, to find your clarity, and avoid categorization, avoid labeling, avoid certainty. So in this very uncertain future that we're facing, the best way to look at it is future back in a full spectrum way. So the present is so noisy, so painfully noisy, that we need to look back in order to get our clarity, or what we call in the Office Shock book, our flexive intent. We want to be able to be very clear where we want to go, but very flexible in how we get there.
And in the research, particularly the research in your previous book on full spectrum thinking, what are some of the barriers that we all face in trying to think full spectrum, to avoid those categories, to be flexible about where we're going?
Yeah, it's so noisy, and we're in what the neuroscientists call the eternal now. Our brains kind of pull us into this polarized present, this very noisy polarized present, and it kind of forces us into yes/no choices, in binary choices, and that just doesn't work well in this kind of world. In a way, Joseph, binary computing is the ultimate categorization. It forces us into zeros and ones. And the good news is the next generation of computing, when you think about big data analytics, big data visualization, gameful engagement, blockchain, ultimately quantum computing, it's beyond binary. It's really thinking in a full spectrum way. And we need to think in a full spectrum way to get us out of that noisy present, to get us out of that polarized present, to get us in to a sense of clarity of direction, which we can have. We can have clarity, even though we can't have certainty. But there's a trap. There's a trap in the present, and the trap is all about this very polarized, very simplistic present that's so noisy and so all-encompassing that we have to get out of it. And the way to get out of it is by thinking future back. The way to get out of it is to think in a full spectrum way and get out of these simplistic categories. And that's exactly what we've done with regard to the challenge of the future of work, the future of offices.
So is there an example or two that brings to life the importance of thinking full spectrum across those gradients of choice to be able to open up conversations and conscious choices about what do we want to do now?
Sure. So at the Institute, we're always looking for signals. And, signals, William Gibson said it best. He said, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And those unevenly distributed events or indicators, those are what we call signals. So the signal that sort of triggered our book, Office Shock, was the COVID shutdown. And the COVID shutdown, if you recall that time, when we all got the notices that we were sheltering in place or that we couldn't go to the office, the moments, those were the signals. And remember what it felt like in those moments. Those moments were so threatening. I mean, so surprising, even though at Institute for the Future, we've had COVID-like pandemics on our forecast since 2009. So the pandemic itself wasn't a surprise. The details and the occurrence and the event, that was the surprise. And then, of course, the second and third and fourth order impacts. So when that event happened, what the actual shutdown, we were told to stay at home or told you can't go to the office. At that moment, that's exactly when future back thinking helps. So future back thinking would have reminded us that what we do together is important. So my favorite definition of government is what we choose to do together. In a COVID crisis, that's the moment where we have to realize that that's something we have to do together. We can't solve a pandemic alone. We have to have practices. We have to have a kind of future back view of how we're going to get out of this. And if you think back to that period, we were overwhelmed by the noise. We were overwhelmed by the deniers. We were overwhelmed by the threat. And there were just a few voices that were trying to help us think back about the public health emergency. And if you look globally, there were many different responses to that challenge, some of which were good and some of which were not good. So to me, that how we think about the challenges and how we thought about the challenges of the early COVID shutdowns, that was a classic example of how we got stuck in the present, the polarized present, the noisy present. And future back thinking, when it happened, helped us to pull up and to specify what's the clarity in order to get out of it.
And building on that, in the research and the writing of the book, that question, do we go back to the office or do we stay at our home office for those that have it? Do we go back 2 days a week or do we go back 3 days a week? Those questions, it sounds like, Bob, were almost being set up in a binary way. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. And, what motivated us to do this book is there was such a strong pressure about when do we go back to the office. as if the office was a perfect place, as if the office was worth going back. And, as we all know, some offices are not worth going back to. And it is possible to do much better. Now, there's a reason why offices can make sense, but it ought to be a question asked, not an assumption made. So what we've tried to do in the book is to take a future back view, to take a full spectrum view of the ways of working, the ways of living, and help people make their own choices. And as we thought through, because we're not here as futurists, we're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to use the future back view, to help you make smarter choices. And what we realized was the noisy present was all focused about when do we go back. What we're trying to do is to say, this isn't just the great resignation. This isn't just the great reset. This isn't just quiet quitting. It's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity to think future back about what are the options. And that's where we introduce these 7 spectrums of choice, which we're going to hint at in this session today and go much deeper in later. But the 7 spectrums of choice, the first thing we realized was that question of when do we go back to the office? Well, that's a good question. But as we thought this through future back, it was number 6 out of 7 questions. Even though most people were saying that's the question, we were saying, yeah, it's a good question. But the first question is why an office at all? And there are good answers to that, but you need to think through those. What's the purpose? What's the outcome you're seeking from an office? That's where you should start.
Yeah, and I think when we actually applied our future back approach, asking the question, what future, on that spectrum of place and time, what did we come up with? We came up with the office verse. How did the office verse reveal the choices or the spectrum of choices for we're getting really focused on, all right, so what do we do now?
Yep. So we began with the office, and the office is the place where work gets done, and traditionally it's a place, it's an office building, a noun. And then we realized, well, there's not only a noun, a place, there's a verb, officing, as we called it, the ways people work, whether it's physically or virtually. And then how do we pull that all together? That's where we were stretching our thinking and calling it the office verse. We came up with that term in the midst of the kind of hype around the metaverse, and we didn't want to get pulled into that hype, but we did want to apply the good ideas that are coming out of that conversation. So we came up with the term office verse, but realistically, it's not just the office verse, it's also the factory verse. Because there are some businesses, including a number of our clients, where factories are really the center, not offices. And then there's others where the retail store is the center. It's the retail verse. And there's offices involved. There's maybe factories or distribution centers or suppliers, So it's really a question, given your business or your purpose, what is the core? And the core could be an office, it could be a factory, it could be a store, but you begin with that core, you begin with your purpose, the why. And we're providing a future back view for that why. So, this is not the time to make firm commitments to going back. This is the time to explore new commitments to going forward and essentially doing it better. It's a historic opportunity to do it better.
Mm-hmm. So that's a wonderful explanation of how we applied future back in that spectrum of place and time to help reveal the choices, office buildings or an office verse or a factory verse or a retail verse. Again, as you said, depending on the context where you are and your organization may be. Also nice to see the application of future back to reveal what are the spectrums of choices for purpose, the why. And we wrote about varying different understandings of why, which everyone will have depending on where they are in their career. Could you walk us through what are some of the full spectrum thinking about that spectrum of purpose?
Sure. Well, purpose is the beginning, and it is the why, and it's the intent. Why are you doing this? What's your intent? Um, and that to me always should be the beginning. And interestingly, during the COVID shutdown, the Blue Zones Project, which is one of the more interesting and intriguing healthy living projects, was funded by National Geographic almost a decade ago now, to look for the healthiest, happiest, longest living parts of the planet. And interestingly, there weren't any of those in the US when Dan Buettner, the lead author, did the first study. They eventually found a small community outside of Los Angeles that qualified. But the point is, they've now extended this, and they've done continuing research, and there's several communities around the US modeling it. And one of their big studies out of the COVID period was that people with a sense of purpose are happier, healthier, and they live up to 7 years longer. If they work for purpose-driven organizations, they live up to 14 years longer, and the companies are higher performing. So we know that purpose-driven people, we know that purpose-driven organizations do better. So begin with your purpose. Why an office at all? And you're right, it varies. So for young people early in their career, in-person is really important. This is a time where travel is a great thing. Learning how other people live is a great thing. It really is a time of outreach and engagement, and that can best be done in person. We know that in person is better for orientation, for trust building, for renewal, for early stage creativity, for culture building. We know that. But offices, if that's your purpose, offices need to be designed that way. I was talking with the CEO of a big Midwestern company who was in his office as I was talking to him virtually. And I said what I just said now about what in-person meetings are best for. And that's the argument for going to an office. And he looked around and he said, our office isn't very good for that stuff. And the worst scenario was he sees people commuting an hour to get to the office and then closing their door to do a Zoom meeting. That's really a negative scenario. So the question of purpose, the first one is, what's your intent? And how does the office help you pursue that intent?
And again, a good example for our audience as we're preparing for the launch of the book next week, to understand how thinking future back, setting that ideal, preferred, plausible, and in some cases provocative, we'll talk about outcomes in a second, that preferred future with more purpose because of all of the benefits that you mentioned, that opens up a conscious choice about what kind of an organization, what kind of an office do you want to work in? And it may be that purpose could be more focused on professional development, professional gain, and perhaps a more healthy living is not as important. And what is nice about applying full spectrum thinking is that that's okay, as long as there's awareness of the spectrum of choices and then a conscious choice of what makes sense for you at that point in time, what makes sense for your organization at this point in time. And then ideally, you're also connecting and synchronizing with the community choices as well.
Exactly.
Let's move over to outcomes, just because you've mentioned it a couple of times, and that one is a little bit more provocative, thinking future back on what might be a future with more prosperity, and then thinking about some of the choices that are across that spectrum.
Sure. So where purpose focuses on intent, outcomes focuses on results. What are the results you're seeking? And our spectrum here runs from profit, like shareholder value, to prosperity, which is really community impact or community value. At the Institute, we have a big project underway now. Marina Gorbis, our colleague, leads it around the equitable enterprise. And what are ways of designing organizations that are not just focused on profit for a few, but are focused on benefit for more? And what are the new models? What are the new ways of doing that? So this spectrum of choice is trying to encourage people to ask more basic questions. And again, question ask, not assumption made. And how do you open this new conversation, future back, about better models, cooperative structures, more equitable models, not just training people for jobs, but also imagining jobs that are more healthy, that are more fulfilling, that are more generative of prosperity for more people. How do you pursue that notion? And Future Back, this gives us an opportunity to ask those questions in ways we haven't been able to do before. And it gets back to that challenge of the polarized present. Part of the polarized present is the rich-poor gap, which is getting worse. So how do you think future back in a way that helps us improve on that spectrum of outcomes?
And we had a wonderful signal a month or two ago with Patagonia, making a very clear choice about a more prosperous future. Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting to see how that signal picks up in other economic areas with other businesses and other leaders potentially modeling some of that. But again, as you pointed out, Bob, full spectrum thinking is not about the absolutes, but it's being clear about what are the choices and then having those conversations to make a choice for what makes sense right now with the aim of making that preferred future closer to reality, but yes, flexible on how we get there.
Yes, and in the book, we spend a lot of time assessing the work of the economist Mariana Mazzucato, who is based in Europe and is looking at what she calls the spectrum from shareholder value to stakeholder value. And how can we move that to include more stakeholder value? And she has an amazing concept that we build on in this chapter called the economics of hope. How can we create an economics of hope? So we have to look future back to figure out what is realistic. And what we're searching for is something that is, neither utopian nor dystopian, that is aspirational, but still achievable. And that's the kind of exploration that we're encouraging in that chapter. And I think it is possible to create an economics of hope. But right now, you've got so many people so overwhelmed by that economy that they're hopeless. And we need to create an economy that encourages more realistic hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that polarity of shareholder and stakeholder is a good example of the extremes that make it difficult to create that economics of hope. Let's move over to the next spectrum on climate. In that chapter, we bring in some of the models like circular economy, donut economics as well. How do you see the full spectrum thinking playing out in the climate impacts spectrum?
Yeah, so we thought a lot about this, and as futurists, we're focused future back on outcomes, and perhaps the biggest threat for us as a planet is climate over the next decade. So the spectrum here runs from net zero to regenerative, and the Institute for the Future has been in this game a long time. We did our first climate study in 1977, so we've been thinking about it a long time and encouraging people to think future back. Now, I think finally people are getting the importance of it. And, you're deeper on this than I am, Joseph. And in particular, you introduced the UN framework for sustainability that we've used throughout the book. So I'd actually like you to build on this one in terms of how we use the UN standards and how we built those into our future back view.
Well, thanks for that. It's been amazing to be able to look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, all 17 of them, and use those as inspirational futures. And by looking at them not as detailed prescriptive solutions, which we know they can lead to, but in many cases they are too ambiguous, we actually, as futurists, thinking future back, encouraging full spectrum thinking, find that those SDGs are actually quite powerful visions of where we should be aiming for. And then that gives us the space to be able to work together to make the choices in a flexive way, with that flexive intent, as you said, Bob, to be able to actually make real progress in communities and in organizations towards achieving those SDGs. So that was a great way for us to illustrate what the scenario of a future with more or less climate impact, better managed climate crises could be. Mm-hmm. And so that, I think, was a really interesting insight as we were doing the research and writing. However, we've mentioned a few times with purpose, with outcomes, and now with climate, the importance of conversations, the importance of making collective choices. Let's move over to the next spectrum on belonging. Your reflections on how we applied full spectrum thinking to that spectrum of belonging, which is all about how do people feel that level of trust in order to be able to have the space for those conversations to make those sometimes difficult choices towards preferred futures.
Yeah, and this is interesting. Again, the order in which we consider these spectrums of choice, they are in order, and we're recommending that you do them in order. So you begin with purpose, then outcomes, then climate, then you ask the question. Then you ask the question, with whom? With whom do you want to office? And again, if you think about the traditional office, you go back to the old-fashioned office. You go into an old-fashioned office and you look around, everybody looks the same. They dress alike, they talk alike, they look alike. It's been an office in the past that has encouraged familiarity. And there are advantages to familiarity. I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but in a world, if you think future back, in a world of diversity, that's not where you want to be. So if you look 10 years ahead, the world is going to be more diverse no matter what we think we want. It's going to be more diverse. That's just a given. It's going to be harder to categorize, harder to be labeling racial, ethnic, content, thinking differences. It's going to be a more diverse world. So our spectrum here is from the familiar to the different. And we particularly look for intentional difference. How do you design for diversity? How do you link diversity in such a way that it promotes innovation in particular? So here we worked with one of the leading diversity consultants, Ibrahim Jackson, and we modified a model that Ibrahim has developed to ask ourselves the question, thinking future back, where does diversity fit into this? Where does inclusion, where does equity fit into this? And thinking about what's the spectrum of diversity to create an office environment that has a stronger sense of belonging, that has a stronger sense of culture, even in a world that's increasingly distributed. So that's a real challenge, is how do you create that culture of belonging at a distance, especially since orientation and trust building is best done in person. So what's that mix, and how do you blend those realities?
And you mentioned the neuroscience earlier, particularly around purpose and working with more purpose-led organizations. The neuroscience in our research on that spectrum of belonging is fundamental to influence. Do you feel more comfortable with people who are more familiar, who look, sound, even smell the same, versus being more proactive and engaging with people who are different from you? And that future scenario where everyone is different. And in that chapter, we have a wonderful illustration from an indigenous Argentinian artist, where she is celebrating her uniqueness from her history. And everyone will be able to do that in a very, very near future. So I'm just going to make a quick plug. Ibrahim will be my guest in a few weeks' time, where we're going to have the opportunity to have a more in-depth conversation with him about his experiences in cultivating belonging. Now, we've mentioned a little bit of the neuroscience. You mentioned also earlier the importance of making connections. Technology is something on everyone's mind now, particularly with ChatGPT, with AI art generation. Tell us, moving to technology. So we've got who are we working with? Then how are we using technology to help us span that spectrum of augmentation?
So the future back view here is really provocative. If you think future back about the human augmentation potential, 10 years from now, we're pretty much all augmented in some way. We're all cyborgs. We're all cyborgs. Now, what that means is that the augmentation is going to get dramatically better. Now, a lot of us are augmented in some way already, but future back, we're going to be augmented in increasingly sophisticated ways. And this is one of these technologies that's taken what AI, the term artificial intelligence, was coined more than 65 years ago. So, this is 65 years to be an overnight success. But if you look at all the conversation around ChatGPT, or we use GPT-3 to help write this chapter. Actually, we have a poem in there that's GPT-3 generated. If you look future back, we're all going to be augmented. And the key question, our colleague Marina Gorbis is the first that I heard ask this. The key question is, what can humans do best? And what do we want to keep for ourselves? And what can computers do best? And how do we want to blend and augment those realities? So over the next decade, AI is going to get practical. We're all going to be augmented in some way. And the question is how.
And that's a wonderful example, Bob, of applying full spectrum thinking. You're not going to the dystopian end of the spectrum where AI is going to replace us, which is the buzz within the design and art community, particularly in response to AI art generation. Yeah. It's also coming up in the programming community as ChatGPT is able to generate pretty good apps within a relatively short period of time. Yes. It's also within the graphic design space as well, able to design nice websites. So you're not going to that spectrum end, but you're asking that question, or asking us all to ask the question, what do humans do best, or what do we do best? And maybe a twist on that is, what do we want to be doing?
Exactly. That's the challenge. And, here in this chapter, we drew from the work of Tom Malone at MIT, and particularly his book called Superminds. And I love the way Tom thinks about it, and I love his language about it. What he says is the big story of AI over the next decade is not computers replacing humans. That's a story, but it's not the big story. The big story is, what can humans and computers do together that has never been done before? That's the big story. And that's what Tom Malone calls superminds. We've got the opportunity to create superminds that are definitely human, but are blended with reality. And, I'm an author. I write books. So 10 years from now, if I'm still writing books, I'm going to have to be augmented. That's just the reality. And we all have to face up to that reality.
Right. So that is our spectrum number 5, augmentation technology. We've spoken about spectrum 6, place and time. That spectrum was the office building and the office verse. Let's now move to the last spectrum on agility. And this is also something that you wrote about in a few of your previous books, particularly, again, full spectrum thinking, about shape-shifting organizations on one end and more stable structures on the other end. What are some of the signals that you're seeing that we need to be thinking full spectrum about how we organize ourselves and how might we be more agile in a VUCA world?
Yeah, so this is the seventh spectrum, and it pulls everything together. We all will have to be to thrive in this future. We all will have to be essentially corporate athletes. We're going to have to be physically, mentally, and even spiritually, but not necessarily religiously, even spiritually grounded in the face of all these challenges and fears and all these polarities that we're going to have to encounter and engage with in some way. So the challenge is, how do you braid things together? We also use the word braiding. How do you braid that shape-shifting organization together in such a way that you can be responsive and future ready, but can have that clarity of intent and that flexibility of execution? And here we've learned a lot from the military, and I'm not a military guy by background. I'm very hesitant about military metaphors, but we have to look for lessons wherever we can. And the lessons here are coming from organizations that are faced with life and death challenges and have to figure out organizational structures that work. And we talk in this chapter a lot about the nature of shape-shifting organizations, and how you can design with hierarchies that come and go depending on the need, with responsive abilities. And the ways to get ready for that, the way to get ready is gaming. We talk a lot about gameful engagement and voluntary fear exposure, to practice in low-risk ways to be ready for that highly uncertain future.
Yeah, those online gaming communities that we refer to, again, as signals in the book, really indicate, even in sports virtual, that people who are playing and have that mindset of gameful cooperation are able to quickly put together a team with a shared goal, whether it be to win an ice hockey game, or in platforms like World of Warcraft or League of Legends, to be able to come together and actually make things happen. And we anticipate, again, as a signal, the next generation of gamers coming into the workplace are going to not only bring that kind of experience, they're going to expect that kind of experience. So again, when we're thinking future back of agility, of shape-shifting versus stability, we are certainly anticipating that there is going to be more and more need for shape-shifting organizations just from that new generation coming into the workplace.
Exactly. And they're going to have a competitive advantage over those of us who are elders, are more than 26 years old. That's probably the definition of an elder. So these young people are going to have a competitive advantage. And I'm really optimistic about them if they have hope. And that gets back to the economics of hope and to the need for clarity of vision and practicality of aspiration.
Yeah, and maybe with that, let's do a quick rewind just to wrap up our 7 spectrums of choice. These are the 7 spectrums that make up part 2 of the book. First, purpose. And that spectrum, where we need to be thinking across the spectrum, full spectrum thinking, is between more individual purpose and collective purpose. I think Bobby gave a great example of blue zones where there's more collective purpose, where organizations that have more purpose are demonstrating the increase in happiness. The second spectrum on outcomes, profit versus prosperity, that shareholder capitalism and stakeholder capitalism model, and finding the right balance. Very related to climate impacts, where we, as you mentioned, begin with net zero because we need to start at net zero. That has to be a starting point. Otherwise, we are all going to suffer very quickly, particularly as we miss our targets for global temperature rising. But trying to have that more aspirational future of regenerative, which we see and we bring examples in the book, primarily in agricultural zones ecosystems that are regenerating. This is, again, an aspiration where they should be bringing those into communities as well. That community perspective, the spectrum of belonging, choices to be made between familiar and different. And I like what you said, Bob. It's not that familiar is bad and different is good. It's finding the right balance. Similarly, on augmentation, what do we want to be doing? What are we good at? And how can technology enable us? Not as a replacement, unless that's a conscious choice. Place and time spectrum, number 6, physical buildings, the office, and then that aspirational idea of an office verse inspired by the metaverse, but then more importantly, opening up our thinking about what are all of the options of our workplace. And in the debate that's happening on the future of the workplace, we do feel that it is a bit on the extremes. So having more conscious choices and making that shared idea of what is the place and time that we're working, that's critical. And then lastly, between a stable structure and a shape-shifting structure. Those are the 7 spectrums of choice that we believe are important for all individuals, organizations, and communities to be thinking across, and thinking across with an aspirational goal in mind, that future scenario, then to be able to inform, if that's the future, what are some of the experiences in that future? A future where we have more difference in our offices. Then what are some of the choices that we want to make now? Mm-hmm. So that's the mixing board. And we're going to spend more time going through the metaphor of the mixing board. But I think you can already see the hint is, if you're making choices, then critical is going to be finding the harmony between those choices. And then you'll have to synchronize with choices that are made by your organization and choices that are made in your community.
And Joseph, that mixing board is here in a little tear out for the paperback book that just will be coming out next week, and it's on our officeshot.org website as well. So that's one of the key elements, is this is a framework for us provoking your choices. And again, we're not telling you what to do. We're just giving you a practical and visionary of Future Back framework for making those choices. And Joseph, I have a question for you. We haven't mentioned yet that your background, your PhD is in workplace architecture. And you did a lot in this book about the history of architecture and what that tells us. So it's true, we're looking future back, but we also look 50 years back at the history of architecture. So could you say a bit about that and just your lessons as a former workplace architect as you've taken this Future Back tour?
Well, thanks for reminding me of that, Bob. So in our initial chapters of the book, we actually look backwards to look forward. And we did that not only, Bob, from the point of view of the architecture of the office, but also technology. We know that Zoom has been around for a while. Teams has been emerging. WebEx has been around. Many platforms, but it's only because of the shock of COVID that we all made that switch to be able to start using them. And in many ways, it's the same with the office. When I was practicing 20 years ago, there was an interest in creating spaces that were encouraging creativity, that were encouraging more serendipitous interactions for more innovation, that were also providing opportunities for more quiet and focused time, that were also based on furniture that was agile. And what's interesting to look back on my career is that it took these kinds of shocks, first the home office shock, if you will, to be able to think differently about the Office First, the different places that we work. WeWork is a good example, and other co-working spaces that have emerged in the last couple of years is a great example of that in-between stage. And I would almost think that Starbucks played a critical role in that, because all of a sudden people wanted to stay in a Starbucks. Coffee was good, nice music. There was even the coffee aroma pumped into the restaurant, but there was also free Wi-Fi. Couches were pleasant. So it's interesting to see how the boundaries of traditional architecture, traditional offices have been breaking down over the years, but have been accelerated by the shocks of the office. In addition to changes from our understanding of diversity and inclusion, belonging and equity, our understanding of Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all of these have been coming together, and that's what we collectively refer to as office shock.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Bob, I've got a last question for you. You've written how many books? A dozen?
This is the 13th, so we just turned a dozen. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm curious. We're about to launch your 13th book, my second book, Chris's first book, next week. What are some of your reflections, your wisdom, when a book like this comes out in the time that we're in now? What's your scenario in 10 years for office shock?
Mm-hmm. So our definition of office shock that we lead the book with is abrupt, unsettling change in where, when, how, and even why we work. So that definition, I think, is based in the COVID crisis. That was the abrupt part of it. Over the next decade, this notion of rethinking how, when, where, and why we work, that's going to go on, and it's going to still be unsettling. So we're in a long, unsettled period. It's not just going back to the office. It's going forward to something that I hope will be much, much better. So I think this is a book where most of my books have focused 10 years ahead. This one is more closely linked to the moment. And the moment is more closely linked to the possibilities, those future back possibilities that we talk about in the book, and the framework, the spectrums of choice that we're giving people in the book. So to me, this is the book that has the greatest hope of helping people make a better future.
Well, it certainly, I think, was a motivating force. All those late nights of research and writing and debating and learning from each other. With that in mind, on Thursday for our second Office Shock Talk, I'll be spending time with our co-author, Chris Bullitt. And Chris and I are going to be talking about two important elements of the book, which are really designed to do, as you've identified, Bob, to be able to help people deal with that our noisy now. The first one is the Quick Start Guide. And the Quick Start Guide, as you had mentioned, Bob, the Quick Start Guide is in our color pullout. That is the contents of part 3 of the book. And that is really the manual, if you will, to apply office shock, think future back, what future, what next, what now, and then to get to those choices. And that's the second point, and I'm excited that Chris and I are going to be speaking on Thursday. Chris did research at her time at MIT on critical success factors. And so in part 3 of the book, our critical success factors are really our recommendations to trigger conversations about those choices for individuals, for organizations, and for communities across all 7 spectrums. It can get a bit complicated, and so that was why we created the Quick Start Guide. But on Thursday, we'll be talking about that in much more detail. We will also be having our book launch next week, the 17th of January, and really excited that Marielle Ibrahimi will be moderating a conversation with the three authors, Bob, Chris, and myself. And then afterwards, every week, we will be having a deep dive on a spectrum. So Bob, you did an amazing job in a really short period of time describing that scenario of a preferred plausible future, giving a few examples, those signals that you mentioned, what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks with the experts that we brought into the research and helped guide us in writing will be to go deep into those spectrums. So that's what we've got planned for the next couple of weeks, all in preparation for the launch of OfficeShock to the market on the 17th. There's one question, where can people learn more about OfficeShock? I would recommend go to officeshock.org. All one word, officeshock.org. That will send you to our Institute for the Future microsite. You'll find a lot more information there. You will find the illustrations that we mentioned very briefly for all of the spectrums. You'll find those scenarios that Bob also briefly mentioned. And you'll find also ways to get in touch with us and to also join the conversation. So OfficeShock, the book, was a piece of research that was triggered by a Swiss furniture company with the intention of sparking a conversation, having the opportunity to discuss, debate, and collectively, individually, and organizationally make some choices about how to turn OfficeShock into, as you mentioned, Bob, that great opportunity for creating better futures for working and living.
Yes, and we do owe a strong thank you to USM, the Swiss furniture company that sponsored this research and got us going. And I think we can post here the resources that we have available at Institute for the Future if you want to dive down in more depth.
Yeah, and with that, as always, the iftf.org/events page has all of the Institute for the Future events. Those events include training on what Bob and I have been referring to as future back thinking. That's part of our Foresight Essentials program. Okay? So you'll see that on the iftf.org/events website. And then you'll see on the page here, for those who are interested in purchasing the book, it is available now through our publisher, Barrett Kohler. Next week, it will be available on all of the websites and also bookstores as well. You'll see that we're offering a code direct through the publisher for 30% off. Print books can only be ordered through the publisher with the code in the US. But again, Leslie Crandall from Barrett Kohler, more than happy to have conversations about bulk purchases. And if there's interest in getting involved in the OfficeShock conversation through our councils or through any of the other ways that we are hoping to achieve USM and CEO Alex's vision of creating a conversation about the future of workplace that's broader than just how many days do we go back into the office or how many days are we in the home office, then please do reach out to John Clemet. His email address is at the bottom of that slide. All right, super. Well, always like to have a little bit of breathing time. Bob, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to kick off our OfficeShock talks. It is going to be an enriching and exciting couple of weeks with the book coming out next week. We're going to be posting more. We're going to be sharing more. And again, trying to stimulate the conversation. How might we all turn OfficeShock into a great opportunity for creating better futures for working and living for everyone? Bob, have a great day, and want to thank everyone in the audience for attending. We will be posting a recording of this talk on YouTube, and you'll see it always available in LinkedIn. Please do send any feedback on how we might improve our upcoming talks, and looking forward to seeing everyone on Thursday with Chris, and then next week, the 17th, with Mario for the book launch. And again, a Happy New Year to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.